LogosTV welcomes you to its program, Coptic Civilization. I'm Michael Saad. This segment is about civilized resistance. What does it mean? The Copts have been under persecution or oppression for so many centuries and maybe 2 millennia. But their response to persecution has been civilized. And aspects of Coptic civilization expressed this resistance and this spiritual level. Coptic civilization is built upon the words of Christ, love your enemy, bless those who persecute you. With us today, our guest, Dr. Fatin Guirguis, professor of English and literature at Polk State University in Florida. Her PhD dissertation was entitled The Vision of Theophilus, Resistance Through Orality Among the Persecuted Copts. How the oral tradition of the journey of the Holy Family in Egypt and the vision of Pope Theophilus the 23rd, Pope of Alexandria, was instrumental in the Coptic resistance against persecution. Doctor, please enlighten us on this theme. That's a whole new theme to me. It's a revelation. Tell us more about it.
Well, actually, absolutely. You know, to be honest, the vision of Theophilus and the visit of the Holy Family to Egypt, and the fact that this tradition still exists today and is still so alive in our consciousness, and is so vivid in the way that we interpret our history and we interpret our culture, plays a huge role in resisting civilization erosion and identity erosion, despite many, many centuries of persecution. And actually, you're quite right. I mean, I love the title of the segment today, which is Civilized Resistance, because the form resistance through orality, resistance through creating a space where you can practice your identity through passing the message orally, is a very, very civilized, non-violent way in which an individual is able to succeed in maintaining this wonderful identity in the face of prosecution and violence.
We hear about Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. and their struggle, peaceful struggle or passive resistance. And actually that is what the Copts have been doing for many centuries, under the Romans, under the Greeks, the Byzantines, the Arabs, the Fatimids, the Mamluks, the Ottomans, and now what we know, all of us know all together. And although the pressure and persecution is cruel under all of the above, and for example, the attack on the cathedral during a funeral, and then blaming the Copts for, blaming the victim for what happened. So nobody asked why there were Muslims in the cathedral to be attacked. Actually, the good Muslims were in the cathedral for 12 hours praying with the Copts. And they came out on TV and described how these thugs attacked the funeral. So the Copts did not go back and retaliate. The Copts prayed. And prayer and love your enemy, bless those who persecute you, has been the motto and the guidance. As you said, they created space, and the space was inside the church, and the space was spiritual. Tell us more about the Holy Family journey in Egypt, how the Copts celebrated this event, and how it was imprinted, and how it told them, you stay here. This is sacred land.
Actually, the creation, the visit of the Holy Family to Egypt, I believe, was actually done through the providence of God. When God chose that His only begotten Son would visit Egypt, in particular, was, I believe, because for two purposes. One of them is to overcome the paganism that was rampant in Egypt at the time. And the second is to create a Christian identity for this land and a space for the Copts who actually embraced Christ, so that they would be able to resist centuries of prosecution. And you're right, I mean, the way, there are two ways, or there are several ways in which a culture can resist peacefully the identity erosion that happens. What happens when, in cases of colonization or in cases of prosecution, is that you have two parties. One party has more power over the other. And actually, and we don't want to speak about the physical violence, but we're talking about the cultural violence or the cultural prosecution here, because this, from my perspective, has longer lasting effects than physical attacks. What happens is that in all civilizations is that when another civilization moves in and it has more power and vanquishes this civilization, is that they have the power to write the story from their own perspective. So they write your history. They tell the story from the way they see it, and they have the power to distribute it to the population or to the masses. Whereas those who are under control are not able to tell their story, are not able to tell what really happened. And their sons and daughters actually become the victims of being at the receiving end of this wrong narrative.
Yes.
So really, the best thing that can happen to any civilization, and actually the only means by which any civilization is able to continue and to maintain itself, is by its ability to empower itself through its ability to create the space in which it would be able to tell its own story, practice its own identity, and pass it on to its children. And you have to have a story to tell. You have to have a Coptic identity to tell, so that you would be able to pass it on. And actually, the coming of Christ into Egypt and the visit throughout, the valley of the Nile, has created a very, very rich narrative for us to tell.
Yes.
And what is amazing is that in this narrative, because the trip goes from, actually the Holy Family start the trip in the north of Egypt. They come from Sinai and they go, and actually they visit almost every spot in Egypt. They walk through the inhabited land of Egypt, because although our land is reasonably big, we really live on a very, very narrow strip on the banks of the Nile. And literally, the Holy Family walked this narrow stripe where we live, from the north to the south, with the exception of Alexandria. This is the only area which they did not visit. We know why, for the apparent reason of, hiding from Herod. But the fact that they have visited every spot on this land and left marks, and there were miracles, there were events, there were incidents, and it's a wonderful story for us to tell. In it is preserved the geography of Egypt, the history of Egypt, the faith of Egypt. It really gave, if you look at how people today, the average individual, how they look at those especially who live in these areas, are in close contact, not in the urban areas where they've lost touch with these wonderful miracles. But those who live in these actual areas visited by the Holy Family, you will see that they see Egypt through the lens of the visit of the Holy Family. So they interpret it, they interpret every location based upon the events of the Holy Family, and you will see how this has created a rich layers of history, rich layers of stories, rich layers of miracles, rich layers of events, rich layers of comfort, you know, creating comfort zones for them, right? Because, you know, let me give you an example. When you are in your own house, you create your own comfort zone. How do you create, like if you go into a teenager's room, what does the teenager do? They'll put idle fan pictures or things that they appreciate or they love. Why? Because they want to make the space their own, because they want to make the space a place that is comfortable for them. The same thing happens for each one of us. Once you are in my domain, in my house, in my home, I will be surrounded by the things that make me comfortable. And this is exactly what Christ did through the visit of the Holy Family. He created spaces that are comfortable, spaces that are familiar, spaces that are blessed, as we understand the word blessing, creating, as I say, comfort zones and ownership zones. So, you know, Christ is here, so I own this place, I own this spot. Because I'm Christian and I'm Coptic and Christ came here. So this relationship to the land, this comfort in the land, the fact that nothing can overcome this land, nor can it overcome my Coptic identity and my Christian identity, is embedded in how they read the landscape, because the Holy Family visited it, and if it has been visited by the Holy Family, nothing can curse it. Nothing can change its blessing to a curse. You know? So it's a wonderful, wonderful, of course, story of narrative, of, you know, a narrative that builds identity, a narrative that builds resistance, a narrative that creates the needed space to be able to live under persecution.
Yeah. It's amazing you chose this, the word resistance in your PhD title, on a vision of the patriarch, which most of us take it as a spiritual period, a spiritual text. For our nourishment, spiritual nourishment, but you managed to trace this into the psyche of the Copts and Egyptians who treasure the visit of the Holy Family, the life of the Holy Family. They drank from wells, they healed the sick, and then here comes the vision of Theophilus. I must, please allow me to commend you for translating for the first time the Vision of Theophilus, which we hardly read in Arabic, where the most ancient manuscripts are in Arabic, in the Library of Vatican, as you told me. But I'm glad you translated it in English, and that it is available, if we see on the screen, on Amazon.com, your own translation. And if you just visit Amazon.com and search for Fatin Morris Guirguis or the Vision of Theophilus, you will find what you see on the screen now. And I'll just expand the screen a little to see the cover of the book translation. It's only for $2.99. You read the translation, or the first time ever translation to English of the Vision of Theophilus. Buy it for your children. This version is for Kindle. Buy it for yourself, buy it for your children, have it a conversation on the dinner table. And that passing on of Coptic identity. We complain that Coptic identity is under fire, under suppression in Egypt for many centuries, and even today. But you have room, you have space. You can do it something yourself by buying this version for Kindle, $2.99, and propagating it. The next slide would show the bottom here is the Vision of Theophilus, resistance through orality among the persecuted Copt. This is a PhD dissertation of Dr. Fatin Maurice Guirguis. It's sold here for $69, a paperback. But perhaps if you go to the internet, you can also find another version, maybe even for free.
On MapQuest, if you have access to MapQuest, it's a dissertation. It's really not meant to be sold, but you will find it on, if you have, I'm sorry, not on MapQuest, on ProQuest.
Right.
On ProQuest, you will be able to find it
electronically.
free of
Amazon
charge.
is charging for the paper version, but you can get an electronic version and read the depth of analysis. And also this would be a role model for our second generation and third generations, and for scholarship in America and around the world about how the Copts benefited from the vision of Theophilus and the journey of the Holy Family to resist persecution. If I may go back to this concept of civilized resistance. Some of us, some Copts, do try to do something non-Coptic, non-civilized, and the results are not good. Even if they are good short term, they are never good long term, because Christ invited us to preaching the good news, to embrace the world, to preach the happiness and love and faith and hope to the world, to the non-Christian and to the Christian and to ourselves. What do you say to this negative resistance and positive passive resistance?
Well, my opinion is that as much as violence breeds anger,
yes,
it breeds anger in the person that commits it. Whether, even if it is done in retaliation for something that has happened. In other words, even if you're revenging yourself, and you have every right to revenge yourself in your own mind, it actually leads to the destruction of the soul. Because the anger that it breeds inside has its own repercussions. It has its own spiritual and psychological dilemmas. Also, when we take things in our own hands and we think that we can achieve the divine justice, it's very problematic, as I say, because the person who does this obviously decides that I can do it myself, or and in doing so, there is the questioning of the role of God and the role of peace in the universe and justice and many things. And I don't really think that responding to violence with violence is productive in any way.
Right.
And I'm going to give you an example from the other side. It's actually, I think that cultural prosecution is far worse than physical prosecution. The Romans were not able, they have prosecuted physically the Christians, as we know, it's documented in history in a horrific way. With all sorts of gory descriptions and lions and bloody images and, whatever they could do to the body they were able to do. But that actually strengthened Christianity. It did not weaken it. But if you look at the Ottoman Empire in Turkey, for example, Turkey, when it was overcome by the Ottomans, actually was 100% Christian. Today it is less than 0.05 Christian, which means that 99.5 plus of the population lost their faith. And there wasn't any physical prosecution there. All right. So it turns, and from my perspective, the same thing applies to Egypt. Egypt was 100% Christian when it was vanquished in the 7th century. And today it is, we hope it is 12% Christian. We're not really sure, but we're talking about 12%, up 15%. These are the maximum numbers. But again, we're talking about more than 85% of the population that lost their faith. And again, there was no physical prosecution like in the Roman times. So from my perspective, cultural violence or cultural prosecution is far more effective than physical prosecution. Yes. And I think the same applies to the opposite. cultural resistance is far more effective than physical
Yes.
resistance. Because as I said, physical resistance destroys the soul, but cultural resistance builds the identity.
Yes.
So it really is something that you do for the future. And I always encourage, you know, my students and my friends that, you know, cultural resistance through narration of our own story, telling the truth, creating the space where we can talk about our faith, creating the space where we can talk about our culture, our tradition, the wonderful things that we have and that we share. Recognizing one another, you know, living together in a community that shares and enjoys that heritage is alone, I think it is the most effective form of resistance. It is the thing that allows the Coptic civilization, for example, to exist in diaspora.
Right.
Right? If we don't have loving communities that enforce one another and affirm one another, our Coptic identity is not going to last.
Yes.
You know?
Yes. Yes.
So it's, I believe it is the most effective form
Yes.
of resistance.
Yes.
And this happens on every level. So, you know, each time a wrong story is told, you're able to narrate your own story. Each time your Coptic language is suppressed, you don't have to learn, you don't have to be an expert in the Coptic language. You don't have to be a lingo person, but at least some knowledge of reading Coptic is an act of resistance.
Yes.
Some learning of hymns is an act of resistance. Some learning of your history through listening to the Synaxarium, for example, is resistance.
Yes.
Not only is it resistance, it's identity building.
Yes.
So it really does everything for you. It builds your character, it makes you a happier individual, it gives you a richer life, and it helps you resist
Yes.
identity erosion and prosecution.
Yes. Wow, what a wonderful conclusion to our segment. Thank you so much, Dr. Fatin Guirguis, for accepting our invitation to our program, Coptic Civilization. It has been informative and inspiring that you and I can build and promote resistance against Coptic identity loss by simple things, by watching LogosTV, by supporting LogosTV, because as Dr. Guirguis told us, it's telling the story, telling my own narrative, telling our own Coptic narrative, in front or in contrast to the other bad, negative narrative that the outsiders are telling about us in error, or in lies, or in oppression. So if we can tell our own narrative on LogosTV, we are building our identity, we are protecting it, we are protecting our civilization, and we are going forward. Thank you for watching LogosTV, our program Coptic Civilization. I'm Michael Saad. See you next week.
Yeah.